Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Or welcome if you're new. You're gonna have to be patient with me today. I have a sore throat, so we'll see how my voice is gonna hold up. For those of you who don't know, I'm Junie, and this is the podcast where I research on topics that I think are interesting about being a woman and living in such a patriarchal society as ours. So far, in the past episode, we have discussed how male domination and female subordination are still prevalent norms in our day-to-day life. This faulty relationship can be seen in the gender gap in various domains, including the sharing of domestic responsibilities, educational attainment, employment rates, and participation positions of power. Crucially, this dichotomy of treatment, and therefore its perpetuation, can be easily reconnected, according to scholars, to hostile sexism. This is why understanding how hostile sexism develops, works, and manifests is fundamental to appropriately address it. On this note, I would like to start the episode presenting to you the recent findings on hostile sexism. The research article of today is titled Personal Relative Deprivation Increases Men's, but not Women's, Hostile Sexism, the Mediating Role of Sense of Control. And as usual, you can find the link to this article in the podcast description. The authors of this paper wanted to understand how personal relative deprivation affects hostility towards women among men. Personal relative deprivation refers to the feeling disadvantaged compared to similar others, and it is something that can happen frequently in daily life. Think, for example, of income disparity and feeling that your income or financial resources are significantly lower compared to friends, colleagues, or neighbors who are in similar professions or positions as you. Or also think about social status, when you perceive a lower social status of recognition compared to others within the same social circles, such as feeling excluded from social events or gatherings where similar individuals are included. This feeling can also spatiate in other fields of life, such as educational opportunities, job promotions, material possessions, relationship status, physical appearance, and so on. You will notice in this episode, contrary to my usual tendencies, I will revolve predominantly around male perspectives. This is due to two reasons mainly. First, it's the nature of the study that you're gonna see today, since the question is predominantly around male. And secondly, because I chose to talk about this topic regardless of the gender it is specified on, because sexism is something that is a daily occurrence in women's lives as well. Hence, I believe it's interesting to learn more about it. The authors of today's study wanted to show if this form of deprivation could potentially impact men's hostility towards women. So, they tried to test and hypothesize if reducing one's self-control over a situation could make men experience high levels of personal relative deprivation, and therefore they might try to regain that sense of control back in expressing higher levels of hostility towards women. In other words, I realize this is complicated. They wanted to know if men may use hostility towards women as a way to compensate for the loss of control that they feel when they perceive themselves as inferior. I will be very real with you right now. When I told my mom about this topic and this study that I found, she looked at me like, no shit, Sherlock. Sorry. Because to her, and I imagine to many other women around, this phenomenon is something that is relatable and evident in the daily life. You can find practical example of it. So, to give you some practical examples that may come to mind to you, I was thinking about workshop harassment, where men who feel threatened by women in positions of power or competence may resort to hostile behaviors to allow themselves to regain a sense of control and assert their perceived superiority, or also online misogyny, that is an attempt to assert dominance and undermine the autonomy and credibility of women, or even mansplaining, that is the frequent and condescending explanations to women, particularly in professions or academic settings, as a way to re-establish dominance and diminish women's expertise or intelligence, because by assuming superiority, they attempt to compensate for the feeling of inferiority. Or even also think of street harassment as a way to compensate for men's own perceived inadequacies, such as physical appearance or social status. And ultimately, of course, domestic violence. Before starting to go through this study, though, we need to review some of the terminology of today that we already saw in episode 1. The concept of hostile sexism involves all the negative and antagonistic perspectives that are put towards women. It includes therefore the belief that women are incapable and excessively emotional, coupled with a fear that they strive to disempower men. Hostile sexists exhibit hostility towards women who deviate from traditional female gender roles or challenge men's authority. Needless to say, hostile sexism has been found to be linked to a variety of detrimental consequences for women and for men, because they're not immune to these negative impacts. For instance, authors suggest that aggressive behaviors within intimate relationships undoubtedly impede the fulfillment of men's fundamental relational needs and satisfactions. For instance, authors suggest that the aggressive behaviors within intimate relationships undoubtedly impede the fulfillment of men's fundamental relational needs and satisfactions, such as the need for emotional connection or communication, for example. Hostile sexism can also prevent men from seeking support in close relationships, given that they can perceive support from their partners as potentially threatening to their status. In essence, there exists a power imbalance in which men hold more authority and control than women do. And this is demonstrated by Krumhauber in 2022. And the quote-unquote subconscious purpose of hostile sexism is to defend and rationalize the superior social status and influence of men. The other key term of today is relative deprivation. As we just saw, it refers to the feeling or perception of being deprived or disadvantaged in comparison to others, who are then perceived as more fortunate or better off. But seems to me, connecting the word relative deprivation to its meaning, it's not so straightforward. I went on Google and I looked the etymology behind it. Therefore, what I found is that the term relative deprivation is rooted in the word deprivation, which comes from Latin deprivare. It means to take away or remove something. The word relative is added to the term to describe the concept of deprivation in comparison to others, rather than absolute deprivation. The term was initially used in sociology and psychology to describe the impact of social inequality on individuals and groups. But how does all of this relate to men and women? How is this relevant? To understand this, we have to move back a step and look at how our society is formed and what it has its basis on. Men and women seldom live in segregated neighborhoods, and women can often have positive contact with men on whom they rely also for social support. Also, intergender interactions are embedded in many types of close relationships. Think of siblings, parents, and friends. And in fact, most marriages and romantic relationships are relationships established between people of different genders, and are often considered the highest form of intimacy and trust. Therefore, although men are socially motivated to maintain their power and superiority over women, they can also have reasons to create a bond and intimacy with them. The combination of dominance and interdependence is also reflected by men's ambivalent sexism, hostile and benevolent, that we saw in episode 1. However, I want to point out, and this is crucial, that it is proven that men do experience relative deprivation more frequently than women on a day-to-day basis for how our society is structured and on the values that it emphasizes and praises, such as not having a romantic partner, suffering from repeated rejections by others, and experiencing inferiority in financial statuses. In total, this article analyzes 5 interconnected studies. We'll scan through them and get to the conclusion. to see whether the hypothesis of personal relative deprivation increasing men's manifestation of hostile sexism, are men who feel inferior more sexist? The first and second study aimed to investigate whether personal relative deprivation is associated with hostile sexism. Therefore, they tested whether this association occurred if it was only evident among men but not women. For explanatory purposes, it was also examined whether personal relative deprivation would predict benevolent sexism. This is because relative deprivation, hence the feeling of inferiority, has been already shown to be linked with aggressive and hostile rather than benevolent behaviors. Think of the study of Kaplan and Page from 1968, or even Stiles from the 2000s. The differences between the first and second study is mainly in the region where they were held. Study 1 was in China, and the second one was in the United States. But before addressing all of the results of the study, allow me to explain to you how the variables were tested and controlled. Relative deprivation was assessed by 3 items. 1. I think my development is restricted compared to others. 2. I feel that, compared to others, there are not many opportunities for me to realize my potential. And 3. I do not think I have many opportunities that I deserve. Participants rated their agreement with each of these 3 items. How would you rate yourself? On the other hand, hostile sexism and benevolent sexism were analyzed using a test called the Ambulant Sexism Inventory. This test had 22 questions, 11 of which measure hostile sexism and 11 of which benevolent sexism. Participants answered each question on a scale from 1 to 7, indicating how much they agreed or disagreed with statements such as, women seek to gain power by getting control over men, or also, women should be cherished and protected by men. Their answers are averaged to determine whether the level of hostile sexism and benevolent sexism is, with higher scores showing higher level of sexism, of course. This study found that there was a positive relationship between personal relative deprivation and hostile sexism, meaning that individuals who experienced relative deprivation were more likely to exhibit hostile sexism. The effect of gender on this was also significant, with men generally reporting higher levels of hostile sexism than women. And specifically, the interaction between the feeling of disadvantage and gender showed that the association between relative deprivation and hostile sexism was only significant for men and not for women. In other words, men who felt disadvantaged were more likely to exhibit hostility towards women compared to women who felt disadvantaged. Overall, the results indicate that when men and women experience relative deprivation, they may exhibit different forms of sexism, with men being more likely to exhibit both hostile sexism and benevolent sexism, while women may not demonstrate either form of sexism in response to feeling disadvantaged. I mentioned Study 1 and Study 2, and the results of Study 2 were consistent with Study 1, although the base level of hostile sexism was higher in the United States than China. In Study 3, researchers wanted to see if feeling like being in control over your own life played a role in causing men to express hostile sexism. The hypothesis was that men who experience a lack of control would be more likely to exhibit hostile sexism. Similar to the previous studies, participants completed several seemingly unrelated scales before providing their demographic information. And the study found that when people felt deprived of something that they think they deserve, or who feel like they have less control in their lives, they are more likely to hold sexist and hostile attitudes towards others. This was even true after taking into account other factors such as political beliefs and desire for social dominance. Study 3 therefore replicated the findings of Studies 1 and 2 and further demonstrated that the reduced sense of control acted as a mediator of the process of sexism. Study 4 wanted to see if they could find similar results to study 3, but instead of using the same tools to measure certain behaviors, they used people's intentions to act. To test hostile sexism, the method that was used is called a friend's advice. It was developed by d'Oliveira Laux, I probably butchered the name, I'm sorry, in 2015, and aimed to examine participants' attitudes. In this method, participants were asked to imagine that their best friend, who is a guy, is having a problem with his girlfriend, who is a girl. They were given dialogues with two options. One option that expressed hostile sexism, and another option that was neutral. For each dialogue, participants had to pick one option as an advice for their friend. If they chose the option with hostile sexism, they would get 1 point, while if they chose the neutral option, they would get 0 points. This was done for 4 different scenarios to measure the overall tendency towards hostile sexism. They then added up all of the scores for each scenario, and higher scores meant a stronger inclination towards hostile sexism. When analyzing the data, it was found that sense of control predicted hostile sexism even when controlling for relative deprivation. Controlling for a variable in statistics means that they did take into account the effects of feeling disadvantaged, hence relative deprivation, when they studied the relationship between the other factors. Additionally, when sense of control and relative deprivation were examined together, sense of control remained a significant predictor, and the effect of relative deprivation on hostile sexism was reduced. In simpler terms, having a stronger sense of control seemed to make feeling disadvantaged have less impact on how hostile participants were towards women. The final study aimed to investigate whether there is a cause and effect relationship between men's personal relative deprivation and their hostile sexism tendencies towards women. In order to do so, the research created a temporary state of personal relative deprivation among participants. I found this so interesting, because they wanted to see if individuals in the state of deprivation, compared to those in the neutral condition, would exhibit higher level of hostile attitudes and behaviors. The study consisted in 2 separate parts that were not related to each other, and it was only conducted in the Chinese language. Let's look into it. After providing basic demographic information, participants' sense of deprivation was manipulated. And to do so, they were assigned randomly to either the condition of deprivation group or the control group. The relative deprivation group included 98 participants, the neutral group included 97 participants. Once this was done, they checked how much control the participant felt and their attitudes towards being hostile to women. And actually, if they then acted in a hostile way, they wanted to see how these things were affected by the manipulation. I know that right now, if you're like me, you're asking yourself, how did they manipulate the feelings of disadvantage? To make participants feel deprived, the researchers used a method based on Callan from 2011. Participants were told the study was focused on disposable income, and they were asked to provide background information such as age, gender, residence, marital status, educational level, industry, occupation, etc. And they also had to reveal their financial status by sharing their average monthly income and monthly disposable income after deducing the necessary expenses, like mortgage, rent, health insurance, debt payments, yada yada yada. After providing these informations, participants were asked to write a few sentences explaining why disposable income is an important indicator for one's standard of living. They were then informed that their information would be compared with that of other similar individuals, and even the discretionary income would be evaluated relative to the others that were participating to the study. The group that was assigned randomly to being the deprivation group was told that their disposable income was significantly lower than the average, minus 73%, while the control group was informed that their income was slightly higher than the average, plus 6.21%. Of course, this data was just random. They didn't actually put people compared, just to instill a sense of deprivation. Still, in study number 5, to measure participant current sense of control, they selected and slightly modified 5 items from the original sense of control scale, developed by Lachman and Weaver in 1998. The selected items of this scale were adjusted to capture participants' state and sense of control in the present moment. And the items included statements such as, I currently feel like I can do just about anything I really set my mind to. Or also, I currently feel that when I really want to do something, I usually find a way to succeed in it. This statement aimed to assess participants' feelings of efficacy and control over their own actions. In addition, 3 reverse scored items were included to assess participant feelings of lack of control. These statements were phrased such as, I currently feel that I have little control over the things that happen to me, or I currently feel that what is happening in my life is beyond my control, or even I currently feel helpless in dealing with the problems of life. Higher scores on the scale indicated higher levels of perceived sense of control. As expected, male participants in the relative deprivation condition, compared to those in the control condition, still showed higher levels of hostile sexism attitudes. But let's sum all of this up. As we saw, men perceived disadvantage is known as personal relative deprivation, and it was hypothesized to be linked to their hostile attitudes towards women, specifically sexist beliefs. The researchers also hypothesized that the sense of control could mediate this relationship. To prove so, 5 studies were conducted involving a total of 1,352 participants to test the hypothesis. Study 1 found that personal relative deprivation only predicted hostile sexism among Chinese male college students, not female students. Additionally, this effect was specifically observed for hostile sexism and not benevolent sexism. Study 2, which involved participants from the United States, replicated the findings of Study 1. Study 3 and Study 4 further demonstrated that sense of control acted as a mediator in the relationship between personal relative deprivation and sexist attitudes. The results showed that an increase in sense of hostile sexism, Study 3, and actual hostile sexist behaviors, Study 4, could be attributed both to a decreased sense of control. Last study, number 5, provided causal evidence by inducing a temporary state of personal relative deprivation, which led to a higher level of hostile sexism due to diminished sense of control. The authors are discussing the theoretical and practical implications of these findings for understanding relative deprivation, gender inequality, and potential intervention. But now, what are the practical implications of all of this? This research is important because its practical implication can be used for reducing harmful effects of hostile sexism in our society on both men and women. And it is crucial to find effective ways to decrease hostile sexism, particularly among men. During the COVID-19 pandemic, instances of sexism and violence against women increased. And this could be attributed in part to heightened personal relative deprivation that was caused by unwanted changes and challenges. Think of social distancing measures, quarantine, resource scarcities, unemployment, and the loss of loved ones. And since relative deprivation stems from social comparison, particularly looking upwards to those who are perceived as superior, one possible solution is to encourage individuals, including men, to engage in downward comparison by considering those who are less fortunate. Because by focusing on downward comparison, individuals may then experience reduced sense of relative deprivation and potentially decreased hostile sexism. Moreover, recent research indicates that there is a link between the desire of social dominance and depression. When men feel like their dominance is being challenged, they become more aggressive towards women. Therefore, coping strategies that enhance one's sense of control can be helpful in reducing hostile sexism and its negative consequences. Strategies such as active confrontation, reassuring thoughts, and seeking social supports have been found to heighten the individual's sense of control and could be effective in reducing sexism. It is important to recognize that addressing gender inequality requires not only empowering women, but also understanding men's perspectives and the perception of their experiences and environments. Promoting gender equality involves considering the barriers and challenges that are faced by both women and men. While empowering women through initiatives such as education and equal pay is crucial, this research highlights the importance of examining and addressing men's attitudes and behaviors to foster true gender equality. By implementing these practical strategies, such as promoting downward comparison, enhancing individual sense of control, and considering the perspective of men, can equally be crucial to promote gender equality. So, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if so, don't forget to share with your friends and family. I also encourage you to check out our social accounts on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. I'll be seeing you here next week for another exciting episode. Until then, keep the conversation going, as I always say. See you super soon. Bye!